Welcome back to the Fourth Way Podcast. In this episode, I had the privilege of interviewing Randall Balmer. Dr. Balmer has been a part of evangelicalism his whole life and had experienced its political transformation from the inside. I wanted to talk with Dr. Balmer because his insights are going to be helpful for us in a number of different ways. I want to point out some of those ways now so that as you listen to the episode, you can hone in on the meat of our discussion. First, I want you to see the face of propaganda in our discussion. There are a number of times throughout the interview where we talk about the religious right being genuine, holding on to a true belief, advocating for an appropriately moral stance, etc. But as we've discussed throughout the season, propaganda as we know it today isn't about lies and deception, though it may often include that. It's really about eliciting a response, as Elul identified. That means that propaganda is often less about the truthfulness or falsity of an idea, and more about how such an idea is presented. A fact in and of itself may not be all that meaningful without context and presentation. Some of my favorite commercials, which I'll make sure to link in the show notes, highlights this. These "don't judge too quickly" commercials take viewers through a scene where we get the whole context, but an actor within the scene only gets a snapshot, and hilarity ensues. Because while the actor and the viewer are seeing the same snapshot, only the viewer has the given context through which to interpret the snapshot. So, as you listen to this episode, after first watching those funny commercials, put to the side this notion that we're arguing about whether abortion is moral or not. We're not discussing that at all, really. And if you want to hear why I think abortion is a travesty, you can go ahead and listen to my season on abortion. But what we're really discussing here is not the moral truth surrounding abortion, but how the information is wielded and towards what end it has been wielded. Second, I want you to see the creative power of propaganda. Part of what we discuss in this episode is the transformation of evangelicalism. It's disheartening to know where we've come from in regard to social justice and where we are now. But that's due in part to the way that propaganda polarizes communities, isolates them, and transforms them. So listen out to how propaganda does that throughout this episode. Finally, as this episode is placed in the middle of our discussion on how propaganda works within the racism discussion, I want you to listen out for how propaganda has insulated the evangelical community from repentance in regard to racism, and allowed us to foster racist ideas and policies by lumping all race issues under the umbrella of woke or liberal. This dismissive power of propaganda has perhaps been one of the strongest weapons in the arsenal of racists who are aware that they're racists, as well as those of us who don't see the racist that propaganda has created us to be. I hope this gives you a good guide on some of the major discussion points to look out for. So, here it is, the interview with Randall Balmer. Thank you so much I'm sure your schedule's really busy, so I appreciate you taking time to talk to somebody that you've never even met before. I appreciate that.
That's fine. I'm happy to do it.
Yeah, so just a little bit of background about why I contacted you. 2016 was a really big time for me. I grew up in a Christian school, went to Christian college, taught in a Christian school for a while, and taught all this integrity stuff. And then 2016 comes around, and my mind was just absolutely blown.
What happened to integrity?
Yeah. So I mean that just sent me on a good path. So in some ways, I'm sort of glad that happened from my walk with Christ. But at the same time, it was very disconcerting to me, and so that sent me down a path, searching through a lot of things. But this final thing that I'm kind of grappling with is truth and propaganda. So I've been trying to figure out, how do we know what's true? Like, how do we know what's, how people are using us and manipulating us? And so after reading your book, I was I thought you'd be a great person to contact because I want to talk about how our group has propagandized and to help us to discern through some of those things. So before we get into some of those questions about our group's propaganda, I would love for you to kind of, I don't want you to spend too much time on your qualifications in evangelicalism because I know you can find that elsewhere and I'll put links there. But if you could just give a brief overview of how you're qualified to talk about evangelicals from the inside, that would be great.
Sure. I grew up in what I call the evangelical subculture. I didn't call it that at the time, but looking back on it, this vast interlocking network of institutions and mores and folkways that constitute evangelicalism in America. So I was born in Chicago while my father was a student at Trinity Seminary, now known as Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. And then as his career proceeded over the course of 40 years while I was still at home, we lived in various places as he was pastor of various churches in the Evangelical Free Church of America. So I gave my heart to Jesus for the first time very early, very young, first of many times, and attended vacation Bible school, Bible camp, Sunday school, church many times, several times a week, and then really kind of finished off my formation by becoming an undergraduate at Trinity College in Deerfield, Illinois, and then a seminary student where I actually worked as well at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. Then I headed off to graduate school for a doctorate and onto a teaching career. But I often say that I'll put my evangelical credentials up against anybody, including Franklin Graham, although I concede his father might have been a bit more famous than mine.
All right, perfect. And I will make sure to put some links to some of your lengthier discussions on your background. But we could talk about a lot of ways that our community has propagandized us and others, but I don't think that there's a much more formative issue than the abortion issue and the way that that's been wielded. And that's something that you spend a lot of time talking about in your books. So first of all, I want to kind of zoom in on the timing of abortion becoming a significant issue for evangelicals. And I think the first time that I was exposed to that idea was reading Cruz and Fitzgerald on their works on evangelicals. And they quoted Jerry Falwell in his sermon, Ministers and Marches. And I finally tracked down a copy of that and read it for myself. And I couldn't believe what he was saying. Like he was saying, Christians don't involve themselves in politics. And a decade later, he's at the head of a political charge. And so I think that kind of transformation leaves a lot of people thinking, well, yeah, he transformed right after Roe versus Wade. The timing fits the abortion narrative. Could you talk a little bit about the timing of Falwell's political conversion and the religious right?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. And I will point out something that I think nobody else has observed or noticed, but so I'll take some credit for it unless somebody calls me off of this claim. But I think that I'm the first historian to notice that famous sermon you mentioned of Ministers and Marches, Jerry Falwell preached on a Sunday evening at Thomas Road Baptist Church on March 21st, 1965. And that was the day of the march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. So he was clearly directing his fire against Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders for being involved in politics. And as you say, then a decade later, he utterly flips away from that. Falwell himself claims that what got him mobilized politically was the Roe v. Wade decision of January 22nd, 1973. However, he also concedes that he did not preach his first anti-abortion sermon until February 26, 1978. That's more than 5 years after the Roe v. Wade decision. So that should, cause people to scratch their heads a little bit and wondering if that's a real honest narrative on his part. And I'm not making any accusations because I don't know. I don't know a person's heart, and so I can't really say that. But I'm a historian, and I do know I can recognize facts when I see it. And in the case of the abortion issue, what I've come to call the abortion myth, I will point out that in 1968, this is before the Roe v. Wade decision, of course, 1968, Christianity Today, the flagship magazine of evangelicalism, together with another evangelical group called the Christian Medical Society, convened a conference to discuss the morality of abortion. And 23 heavyweight theologians from the evangelical world gathered for several days, hashed out the issue. At the conclusion of that gathering, they issued a statement saying, we can't agree that abortion is a moral issue, but we think it should be available. Two successive editors of Christianity Today magazine concurred with that sentiment. 1971, meeting in St. Louis, Missouri, the messengers, or the delegates, they call them messengers, but delegates to the Southern Baptist Convention, meeting in St. Louis, Missouri, if I didn't say that already, passed a resolution calling for the legalization of abortion. Now, the Southern Baptist Convention is not generally known as a redoubt of liberalism, but they reaffirmed that resolution in 1974, the year after Roe v. Wade, and again in 1976. When the Roe decision was handed down, evangelicals, by and large, were silent on the matter. The evangelical voices who did weigh in actually praised the Roe v. Wade decision, including W.A. Criswell, pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas, and a former president of the Southern Baptist Convention. So that is just, I mean, there's more evidence, but, that's what I call the abortion myth. And the abortion myth is the fiction that evangelicals rallied or galvanized as a political entity in the 1970s in direct response to Roe v. Wade. And I'll add a personal anecdote to that as well. I spent the 1970s really cocooned in what I call the evangelical subculture. That is to say, I was a freshman in college at Trinity College, Deerfield, Illinois, in 1972. That's just before the Roe v. Wade decision. And then I graduated in 1976. And then after the remaining years of the 1970s, I was actually an employee of Trinity Divinity School, as well as a master's student there. And, again, abortion simply wasn't part of the conversation. This was just not an issue that evangelicals cared about. They considered it a Catholic issue throughout the 1970s.
Yeah, I before we kind of get into that more evidence, because you've got something that was priceless for me that I wasn't able to get somewhere else. But before we get to that, I do want to when I looked at Of Ministers and Marches. So the copy that I got was, I think it was a digital from Liberty's library. So I was kind of skeptical. I don't know if that was altered at all. But it looked like it was legit, but it had the date. And yeah, the Selma thing is interesting. And I believe it was also like 4 weeks to the day after Malcolm X was assassinated. So you've got all of these historical events that are going on at that time. And if you look in his sermon, he even mentions Alabama. Like he specifically mentions it, which is, where the march was going on. So yeah, I think that's too coincidental for sure. So the thing that you gave me that I think would be, if we were in a court of law, I think would be extremely important because, like you said, we can't know people's hearts, and hearsay and all of these other things don't make for great cases. But in your book, you talk a bit about this experience you had. I think it was in 1990 or right around there, where you actually were able to talk face to face with some of the big individuals responsible for the Republican Party and the moral majority. So I would love for you to talk about that conversation, who you talked with, why that was important, what you said, and how that kind of, because that's straight from the horse's mouth, and that to me is powerful.
Yeah, I didn't say much. I listened a lot. I said I didn't say very much at that occasion. Yeah, what happened was that in November of 1990, I was invited. I was at that time an assistant professor at Columbia University, where I ended up teaching for 27 years. But I was invited to a gathering in Washington, D.C. in November 1990. And I actually, for years, I puzzled over why I was invited to this thing because it just didn't make sense to me. And I almost didn't go at the last minute. I had a young family. I was, busy teaching, trying to write books and so forth. And I decided at the last minute, yes, I'm going to go. I went to this thing. So I found myself in Washington, D.C. in a hotel conference room with Richard Land, the Southern Baptist Convention religious right guy, Paul Weyrich, the architect of the religious right, trying to remember his first name, I can't remember at this moment, Ed Dobson, who was at that time, or he had just left, but he had been Jerry Falwell's lieutenant at Moral Majority. Donald Wildman, head of the American Family Association, the guy who was responsible for a lot of boycotts of television at that time. Carl F.H. Henry, the founding editor of Christianity Today magazine. Richard Viguerie, the conservative direct mail guru. Ralph Reed, the director of the Christian Coalition, Pat Robertson's organization. So I find myself in this conference room thinking, I don't think I belong here. And it turned out, I don't think I realized it before I went, but it turned out that the whole conference was meant to mark the 10-year anniversary of Ronald Reagan's election to the presidency in November 1980, 10 years earlier. And so I thought, well, I didn't celebrate 10 years earlier. I'm not sure I want to celebrate now, but I'm here. I might as well make the best of this. And so I'm there and sitting in these sessions. And in the first session, in the commentary, Paul Weyrich made this impassioned speech. He said, let's remember that this movement, meaning the religious right, did not get organized in response to abortion or to the Roe v. Wade decision. Not at all, he said. Let's be clear about this. We got going as a political movement to defend tax exemption in evangelical institutions, including Bob Jones University, which, of course, was segregated. And, again, he was emphatic about this. And so at the end of that session, in a break between the sessions, I went up to him and I said, I want to make sure I understood you correctly. Abortion had nothing to do with the genesis of this movement. He said, absolutely not. He said, I've been trying since the Goldwater campaign in 1964 to get these people, meaning evangelicals, interested in politics. He said, I tried everything. I tried the school prayer issue. I tried the pornography issue. I tried the abortion issue. I tried the women's rights issue. Nothing got their attention until the Internal Revenue Service started coming after places like Bob Jones University. That's what got the attention of people like Jerry Falwell, who, of course, has started his own segregation academy in Lynchburg in 1967. So anyway, that exchange got me started on this sort of decades-long treasure hunt to chase down the real origins of the religious right. And I have to say that I don't agree with Paul Weyrich about much of anything, but on that point, he was absolutely right. Abortion had nothing whatsoever to do with the genesis of the religious right.
Yeah, that's so powerful coming straight from their mouths. And I mean, not to say that I think that they would purposefully lie, but I can't imagine somebody in that group admitting to that today, knowing how powerful the abortion was abortion, the knowledge of one issue voting and all of that stuff. Was that just not at the forefront at that point yet? Like, did they not realize how powerful it was?
No, I think what happened, and I've tried to reconstruct this, is I think there was a kind of a three-part process for evangelical political engagement. The first was a court ruling, and again, it wasn't Roe v. Wade. It was actually the court ruling was the district court for the District of Columbia in a case called Green v. Connolly. And on June 30th, 1971, the district court issued a ruling that said, in effect, any organization that engages in racial discrimination or racial segregation is not by definition a charitable institution, and therefore it has no claims on tax-exempt status. So that was the catalyst, because that prompted the Internal Revenue Service to start making inquiries about places like Bob Jones University, but also various whites-only church-sponsored segregation academies that had been formed to elude or evade desegregation in the public schools. So that was the first step. The second step, and again, this occurred later in the 1970s, and this I credit or I blame Paul Weyrich, who I sometimes call an evil genius. He really was quite savvy in terms of politics and political machinations. The second move was to say, oh, this is not a defense of racial segregation. This is not racism. This is a defense of religious freedom, thereby writing a page from the modern religious right playbook, that you see in the Hobby Lobby case, for example, or in the California cake maker case. This is not a matter of defending racial segregation. We're defending religious freedom. It was a brilliant move. What he failed to mention is that tax exemption is a form of public subsidy, right? There's no debating that. I'll use a personal example. I'm in addition to being professor, I'm an Episcopal priest, and one of my parishes, actually my first parish, was in northwestern Connecticut, in a rather affluent little town in northwest Connecticut called Washington, and we, of course, paid no property taxes in that very affluent community. Because we were a church, a tax-exempt organization. Well, that meant that the taxpayers in that town, not that they couldn't afford it, by the way, they could well afford it, but they had to pay extra for fire protection, for police services, for maintenance of the public parks, and so forth. So tax exemption is a form of public subsidy. So when Paul Weyrich and then Jerry Falwell began crying about this is an assault on religious freedom, they fail to acknowledge that tax exemption is public subsidy. So that was the second move. The third move brings us to the abortion question. Weyrich was savvy enough to recognize that he couldn't effectively build a grassroots movement of white evangelicals simply by defending racial segregation. Even in the late 1970s, that wasn't going to fly. And so he was looking about for another issue. And what happens is that in the midterm elections of 1978, he stumbles on the abortion issue. And here's what happened. Weyrich, again, by his own account, in advance of the 1978 election, went to the head of the Republican National Committee. At that time, it was Bill Brock of Tennessee, former senator from Tennessee. And he asked for money to try to organize these evangelical voters. And according to Weyrich, Brock looked across the desk at Weyrich and said, who are you? Who are these people? Are you crazy? I'm not going to give you any money for this. And so Weyrich, again, by his own account, resolved to go out and elect some rather improbable people during the midterm elections of 1978. And he focused on 4 Senate races, New Hampshire, Iowa, and Minnesota. There were 2 Senate races. One of them was for the unexpired term of Walter Mondale, who, of course, was Jimmy Carter's vice president. And in all 4 of those races, the final weekend of that campaign, pro-lifers, Roman Catholics, because at that time, abortion was a Catholic issue, almost exclusively. Pro-lifers leafleted church parking lots. And an election with a very low turnout 2 days later, all 4 of the favored Democratic candidates lost to anti-abortion Republicans. I remember very clearly reading through Paul Weyrich's archives, which are actually out at the University of Wyoming in Laramie, and looking at his correspondence surrounding that midterm election of 1978. And I've said this often, it's almost like the papers began to sizzle because he realized he finally had found an issue that was going to galvanize grassroots evangelicals. Opposition to abortion was going to work for him as a political issue. Even so, and we're talking then about the midterm election of 1978, so November of 1978. Frank Schaeffer has told me, in again, very emphatically, that when he and his father and C. Everett Koop began touring the country in the first 3 months of 1979 with their film series, Whatever Happened to the Human Race, this anti-abortion film series, he said that the crowds were very, very meager. And the response on the part of evangelicals in early 1979 on the abortion issue was quite tepid. Another bit of evidence, on August 22nd, 1980, Ronald Reagan, the Republican nominee, addressed a group of anywhere from 10 to 20,000 evangelicals. The numbers, the estimates of the crowd vary, in Dallas, Texas at Reunion Arena. This is the event where he famously said to this group, "I know this group can't endorse me, but I want you to know that I endorse you and what you're doing." Brought down the House and arguably sealed the evangelical vote for the 1980 presidential election. I read through his speech on that occasion out at the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, California. And on that occasion, he talked about creationism. He decried Jimmy Carter's unconstitutional agenda against evangelical schools, meaning places like Bob Jones University. He did not mention abortion even once in that address before 10 to 20,000 screaming evangelicals in August of 1980. So even as late as August 1980, the Reagan-Bush campaign was not persuaded that abortion was going to work for them as a political issue in November.
All right. Yeah, I particularly liked how you pulled out some of the language, this focus on religious liberty. I grew up, like I told you, at a Christian school, and I thought for the longest time, and probably until I was in high school, that literally in a public school, you couldn't pray or read the Bible. That was my understanding of secular public schools. And I think religious liberty is used a lot. But as soon as a Satanist wants to do something, or a Muslim, then there's no such thing as religious liberty. It's duplicitous.
Can I interject on this?
Yeah.
The book I'm working right now is biography of Mark Hatfield, a Republican senator from Oregon, evangelical Christian, a Baptist, and he's a real Baptist, by which I mean he understands the First Amendment and the separation of church and state, which is founded on bedrock Baptist principle. You don't mess with the line of separation between church and state. And I just found this in the Congressional Record. This is from back in 1994, July 27th, 1994. And Mr. Hatfield, Senator Hatfield, went to the floor of the Senate to address the whole issue of trying to legislate public prayer in public schools. And he said, I'm going to read just a snippet here. "We are dealing with, of course, a very personal issue in matter of prayer. We're dealing with the issue of protecting religion and religious convictions. I must say very frankly that I oppose all prescriptive prayer of any kind in public schools, as any true Baptist should. By the way, does that mean I'm against prayer? No, it does not mean that at all. I am very strong in my belief in the efficacy of prayer, but I must say that there is no way this body," meaning the Senate, "or the Constitution, or the President, or the courts should ever abolish prayer in public schools. That is an impossibility. I often use, somewhat facetiously, the example and experience of having prayed my way through every math course examination I ever took. I was not praying to the teacher. I was not praying to my fellow students. I was engaging in silent prayer to God. who thought I was more powerful than I, who I thought was more powerful than I, and that all students and all the students put together. All I'm saying is that this can be very personal, and silent prayer is happening all the time. So that addresses your issue. You certainly can pray in public schools. The issue is prescribed prayer in public schools, which is a clear violation of the First Amendment. Sorry to take you down that.
No. That was good. And I mean, again, I think that shows how information is wielded. And I wouldn't say that I think my teachers were maliciously lying to us. There's just this narrative that kind of gets started somehow, and it goes on. So here's a big question for you, because I don't think that abortion is a good moral choice to make. I think that
I agree.
I think that it's terrible, the situation that people are put in. I empathize with a lot of people who have abortions. I understand that there's so many causes that underlie abortions. So what would you say to somebody who says, okay, even if I take your narrative about all this evidence that you give us about how abortion wasn't brought up because people really cared about that, it was kind of used, people were kind of manipulated. Nevertheless, it's true that abortion is killing a valuable human being made in the image of God. And we've arrived at that truth. So at this point, we're still one issue voters, despite our history. What would you say to somebody like that? Why does it matter how we got here?
Well, first, I think it matters. I think racism matters. And I'm happy to address that a little bit later in my in our conversation. But first of all, I agree that abortion is a moral abomination, except for the obvious exceptions, rape, incest, the life and well-being of the mother, and that sort of thing. But I think that's precisely the point, what I would argue. Now, I'm sort of setting aside my historian's hat for the moment and talking about as my understanding of the issue and how it should be addressed as a believer, as a Christian. And I think you put your language was precisely right. I regard abortion as a moral issue, not a legal issue. What I find striking about the abortion debate, or what passes for the abortion debate these days, which I think is a pretty anemic debate, frankly, but that's another matter. But what I find striking is that the only thing that both sides of the abortion debate agree on is that making abortion illegal is not going to make it materially less frequent. So what does that tell us? It tells us that if you're truly interested in limiting the incidence of abortion, the law, the courts, is not going to be the way to do it. Women are still going to have abortions. I mean, let's not kid ourselves about this. If you truly want to limit to the incidence of abortion, we have to change the moral conversation. That is, to change the moral debate. And I'm willing to go to great lengths to do that, including public service billboards discouraging people from having abortion. But let's make clear that we also need to be clear that we also have to couple that with availability of contraceptions, sex education, and measures like that. If we're truly sincere about limiting the incidence of abortion, I think we have several things we have to do. And again, I think it is a moral issue. It's not a legal issue. I mean, just to put it in kind of simple terms, when does the state issue a birth certificate? Right? At birth, not at conception. This is just, and even within Christian theology, the traditional point of no return in terms of the fetus is the moment of quickening, which is several weeks at least into a pregnancy before the quickening is when you feel or can discern the fetus moving on his or her own. I think it's a moral issue. It's not a legal issue.
So then how would you differentiate that between, somebody says murder is murder if a fetus is created in the image of God, and they're killed, and a toddler or an adult is created, why is that a legal issue as opposed to just a moral issue?
Again, I think it's because you have to understand at what point does the state take an interest in the individual. Again, it's not at conception. No, I know that there are some of the anti-abortion people who are trying to kind of roll that back and say that the state has a vested interest in the individual at the moment of conception. But I think that's a heavy lift legally to make that case. I saw a cartoon the other day saying, showing a pregnant woman being pulled over by a police officer and protesting. Well, officer, according to the laws of the state of blank, whatever it is, Arkansas, whatever, my fetus is a person, and therefore I should be allowed to drive in the HOV lane. You get into things like that, and it kind of descends pretty quickly into absurdity.
Yeah, so you would say that trying to make abortion illegal it's almost showing that Christians are sort of reaching for a theonomy of sorts, like they're trying to, and probably the same thing with gay marriage and other sorts of things.
I suppose.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess I have to think about that a little bit longer, but it just doesn't. I mean, it defies common sense, but it also defies, I think, it defies centuries of understanding of gestation. But also, what are the limits of the law? And I want to make it clear in this conversation that I honor those who are sincerely, opposed to abortion in any and all cases, or whatever their position might be. I have a great deal of sympathy for it. But again, I think it should be addressed as a moral issue rather than a legal issue.
Okay. Last question that I want.
Just a minute. Okay. Yeah, go ahead, please. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, this is my last question, and if hopefully it dovetails into. I know you wanted to talk about race here, and I think it'll dovetail into that a little bit. But if it doesn't, you can kind of make it work and get that in. But as part of studying propaganda over the past 6 months or so, I ended up reading Mein Kampf just a little bit ago, and I was really struck by one point that Hitler made. I mean, he makes a lot of brilliant points, unfortunately, for propaganda and how it's used. One of the things that he said is that he's giving this example of if there is you're one person, but there are 4 different people who are against you, they're opposed to you. And he says that can actually make you look really weak because you've got 4 opponents. He said the trick is you have to lump all of those opponents into one opponent. Find some common thread so that you can put them in one category. And Jacques Ellul in his his work on propaganda, he says basically the same thing, where he talks about polarization, or this Manichaean view, this all black, all white, and this polarization. Because if you only have to deal with one idea, then you can just dismiss all of the other ideas that would probably argue you down. So with the evangelical community today, the word liberal or Marxist or woke, those are 3 easy ways to dismiss anything, right? I don't like that information. That's woke information. So you see this with systemic racism, with CRT, with all that kind of stuff. So I think a lot of evangelicals would be surprised, because I was, for sure, that over the last 150 years, the evangelicals have been engaged in quite a lot of social justice issues or woke issues, whatever you want to call them. I'd love if you could give us a little bit of a background of the transformation of evangelicalism in terms of social justice, and then maybe dovetail that into some comments that you might want to make on race in regard to abortion and propaganda.
Yeah. Happy to do that. And, again, as a historian and somebody who grew up as evangelical, one of the things that I started to learn in college was that evangelicals have a very long, and I would say quite distinguished history of social concern, particularly in the 19th century, coming out of the Second Great Awakening. And that concern was directed particularly to those on the margins of society, those Jesus called the least of these. So if you look at evangelical political and social activism in the 19th century, you find they were involved in various peace crusades. They were involved in prison reform. They were leaders in the common school movement, what we call public schools today, or public education, because they recognized that was the way for those on the lower rungs of society to become upwardly mobile and become to join the middle class. They were engaged in the women's rights movement, women's equality. I mean, the opposition to the ERA is just one of the great travesties of my lifetime, in my judgment, particularly because evangelicals lined up against equal rights for women, which is just an utter betrayal of their own heritage, their own history.
Yeah, and that's still not passed, right? I mean, it's still
no, it hasn't been ratified. No, because of Phyllis Schlafly and these other people. So, and the other thing that I learned more recently about evangelical activism in the 19th century is that people like Charles Grandison Finney, who by any measure is the most influential evangelical of the 19th century, were adamantly opposed to free market capitalism, because capitalism elevates avarice over altruism and therefore is not Christian. Charles Finney said that a Christian businessman was an oxymoron. I mean, he didn't use that language, but that's what he was arguing, right? So I look at that history as somebody who grew up as an evangelical and still wants to claim that mantle. And I look back and I say, wow, this is really quite a remarkable history. What happened? Well, again, we probably don't have time. I know we don't have time to get into all the steps along the way, but that general focus really persisted until at least the early decades of the 20th century. Then what happens is evangelicals kind of go underground. This is when they start building their subculture as a place of refuge, as a separate entity from the larger culture. But they begin to go back into the larger world in the 1970s. And again, if you're looking for a milepost on this, you could do a whole lot worse than looking at the 1973 Chicago Declaration of Evangelical Social Concern, which is a remarkable document that seeks to resurrect a lot of the social emphases of 19th century evangelicals. I urge you and anybody else to look at that document, the 1973 version of the Chicago Declaration of Evangelical Social Concern, which really is quite a remarkable document. Then we go through the 1970s. Jimmy Carter, of course, an evangelical Christian, Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher, runs for president in 1976. He captures roughly half of the evangelical vote. And I think many evangelicals were voting for Carter, many of them at least, just out of the novelty of being able to vote for one of their own for president. And then you have the rise of the religious right, which occurs late in the 1970s in advance of the 1980 presidential election. And that's when you get back into this whole narrative about racism and the rise of the religious right. And I think the larger importance of racism here, and it didn't become clear to me until I was writing Bad Faith. The book came out just last August. And I was trying to make sense of how evangelicals got from their origins in the 1970s to 81% of white evangelicals, still a staggering number to me, supporting Donald Trump for president in 2016. Now, this is the man who's really can't be associated with family values very readily. I mean, I think that's probably the understatement of the century so far. And yet 81% of white evangelicals vote for Donald Trump. And I began to kind of retrace my steps historically, going back to the origins of the religious right in the defense of segregation. And it became clear to me that the key intermediate figure in that is Ronald Reagan himself, the man that many evangelicals look to as a political messiah, and or a demigod for that matter. And looking at Reagan's career, Reagan started politics in California in opposition to the Rumford Fair Housing Act, which sought to guarantee equal access to housing. He was an outspoken opponent of both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Throughout his political campaigns, he frequently invoked the racially charged phrase law and order. And anybody who lived through that era can hardly forget his vile caricature of so-called welfare queens, women of color who supposedly were living off the public dole in lives of luxury. He was never able to produce any of these welfare queens, but he was sure they existed. You add to that the fact that as president, he persisted in his support of the apartheid South African government, and he decimated the Civil Rights Commission as president. And for me, the most damning event occurred on August 3rd, 1980, when Ronald Reagan opened his general election campaign for the presidency after winning the Republican nomination. August 3rd, 1980, in, of all places, the Neshoba County Fair in Philadelphia, Mississippi, the place where 16 summers earlier, members of the Ku Klux Klan, in collusion with the local sheriff's department, abducted, tortured, and murdered 3 civil rights workers during Freedom Summer. Reagan was the master of symbolism, but in case anybody missed his intent on that occasion, he invoked the decades-old segregationist battle cry, "I believe in states' rights." So, trying to understand the religious right, you have to understand its roots in a defense of racial segregation and where it ended up in 2016 and 2020 and in the race of Donald Trump. Not exactly the family values guy. You have to also understand Ronald Reagan. You have to loop him into the narrative as well. So, I repeat that I honor people who are dedicated to the anti-abortion cause. I have a great deal of sympathy for them. But I also think it's important to acknowledge racism. And in my understanding as a historian, unacknowledged, unrepented racism tends to fester. And I think that's what we see in 2016 and again in 2020, and now again, even continuing, because evangelicals have failed to account for the racism at the roots of their political movement.
Yeah. And I think what's unfortunate is, I think through the civil rights era, I think evangelicals were sort of starting to account for it. I mean, the point that they couldn't get, a base around segregation shows that, okay, well, people have that in their consciences. But I think the reason I wanted to end with Hitler's quote here, or Hitler's idea here, is because I think it's brilliant what happened. It's terrible, but it's brilliant in that they got their racism by lumping it into this one common enemy, and now we have one issue voters that only see one enemy and one good, and you defend your group, and it's all black and white.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I would love, I've spent arguably much of my career trying to call evangelicals back to their better selves and say, listen, you, first of all, you have the Bible, you have the New Testament, they have the example of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus. And he's pretty clear about what he expects of his followers. He talks about welcoming the stranger, for example. That certainly has some implication for immigration, I should think. Now, I understand that borders are touchy issues and they're difficult issues, but when Jesus tells us to welcome the stranger, it seems to me that has some relevance to immigration policy. Jesus tells us to take care of the widows and the orphans, to visit the prisoners, and to feed those who are hungry. That has certain implications or ramifications for social policy, it seems to me. So I've been trying to emphasize that, but also to point out what I consider the noble legacy of 19th century evangelical activism on social matters. And that, I think, points you in a very different direction from that of the religious right.
Well, thank you very much. And that's all that I have for you in terms of questions. If there's anything that you think would be good to say at this point, or anything that you think I've overlooked in regard to propaganda or anything, I'd love to hear it.
No, I know you've been very thorough. I think one of the things that fuels this movement, that is the religious right, is the rhetoric of victimization. And so you mentioned Hitler earlier, and I'm not trying to draw direct parallels between Hitler and the leaders of the religious right. Please understand that I'm not doing that. But what the leaders of the religious right have been so good at doing is painting themselves, and by extension, all evangelicals, as victims in the culture in some way or another. And I think there arguably some basis for that, but I think it's grossly exaggerated if there is. And I think, frankly, that's one of the reasons they gravitated to Donald Trump in 2016, is because nobody speaks the language of victimization more fluently than Donald Trump. Now, it's always about him. He's always the victim, of course. But I think evangelicals recognized that, and it resonated with them in some way. But I think, as you pointed out earlier, there's real danger in that. There's real danger in that sort of rhetoric, and we're seeing it playing out right now.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I enjoyed it, and again, I appreciate you being willing to take time out of your day to do this.
I appreciate it, Derek. I wish you all the best. God bless.
Thanks. That's all for now. So peace, and because I'm a pacifist, when I say it, I mean it. This podcast is a part of the Kingdom Outpost Network. Please check out the links below to find other great podcasts and content related to nonviolence and kingdom living.